Before we begin, let's do a quick exercise. I'm going to give you 3 situations where some statements will be made about whether a decision is a good one or a bad one. I want you to look at each situation and tell me whether you agree or disagree with the statement. The first one, the terrible situation in Iraq is proof that Bush made a bad decision invading it. Second, I decided to break up with my boyfriend and am so happy now. That shows my decision was good. Third one, the Challenger shuttle blew up and therefore the decision to let it launch was a bad one. Pause the video now and on a sheet of paper write down ABC, do you agree or not? And then continue with this video. Assuming that you have completed the exercise, what we find is that a lot of people, young people, end up agreeing with statement A. Now, let me clarify that I have no political position and this is really not my opinion, but this is a common phenomena that when we see something, a statement that is very aligned with our political views, we stop to think rationally or clearly about it. So the situation here is that a lot of people think that the first statement is okay, as in Bush did make a bad decision because of the resulting crisis in Iraq. But they are less likely to accept that B is necessarily a good decision, and they're even less likely to accept that the third one is a bad decision. So it's kind of funny when people see the third one, immediately they say, oh, you know, we never know what the Challenger folks knew at the time the launch was made, so we can't really tell. It depends on the information they had. But somehow that criteria is not extended to the first and the second one. Perhaps that's because the first and the second are very close to home. So that's something we want to think about as we get into the key question: how do you judge the quality of a decision? And I'll start by throwing out a very bold idea, which is at the heart of decision analysis. You cannot judge the quality of a decision from the outcome. Repeat that. You can't judge the quality of a decision from the outcome. If you do so, that's a mistake. It's a sign of unclear thinking. So for instance, look at this grid. On the horizontal axis, we have bad outcomes and good outcomes, and on the vertical axis, we have bad decisions and good decisions. So I could make a very bad decision to drive drunk, and if I crash, that's a bad outcome for me. But if I drive drunk and I reach home safe, that's a bad decision, good outcome. I could also decide to drive sober, and I could still crash. That's a good decision, bad outcome. And if I'm really lucky, then I drive sober and hopefully I arrive home safe. That's a good decision and a good outcome. So that's the separation of decisions and outcomes. So what do you say now? Looking at all 3 of them, the very first statement, Bush may have made a bad decision invading Iraq, but that has nothing to do with the current situation, in the sense that just because Iraq is in a terrible situation is not the evidence that you need to say that Bush made a bad decision invading it. If he knew what was going to happen in Iraq, he would probably not have invaded. The fact of the matter is we make decisions not knowing how the future will turn out. If we knew the future, we would have no decision to make. So, however, it could still be that he made a bad decision, but we need to know the process that Bush used to arrive at his decision in order to make any judgment. And just because this is a political statement, it's very easy for us to relax our criteria of good decision making when things come out the way we already think it should come out. So it's a red sign that, a red flag that should go up in our minds before we fall into this trap. The second one, I decided to break up with my boyfriend. I'm so happy now. That shows my decision was good. Well, my happiness now has nothing to do with my decision being good. My happiness, current happiness, is an outcome. The decision is purely to be judged based on what I knew, what I had in front of me, and what I could do. And that's the only way I could judge whether the decision was good or not. The third one should be pretty obvious, as we've already explained. Most people get this one and they say, yeah, this is not necessary. Let's try another exercise to get into the second fundamental principle of decision analysis. So for each situation, again, write down whether you agree or disagree with the reasoning below. First, we have invested so much time in Afghanistan, and all of that effort would have been for nothing if we pull out now. B, I have invested so much time in my relationship and I don't want to move on, or else all of that investment would be a waste. C, we have spent so much money on tutors and my skills have still not improved. Even though I believe the next tutor will succeed, I have lost too much money to justify any further expense. Again, please pause the video after I finish speaking and basically rate whether you agree with these statements or not. Assuming you've completed the exercise, we shall now introduce the next fundamental principle of decision making. It is the sunk cost principle. In other words, the past matters only for learning, not for accounting. How does that apply to each of these? So look at the first one. We have spent so much time in Afghanistan. That is past. It's gone. It's sunk cost. The resources and the people whose lives have been lost are not going to come back. But our decision for the future has to be based on what we know in the present. So yes, there are various arguments floating around. So some people say we can't really do anything there, we can't really help the Afghans, so we should just pull out. And the others say that we created the mess, so we should stay on. So those are valid arguments on both sides that need to be examined. But saying that we have invested so much and we shouldn't pull out, that's a mistake of thinking. The past is never coming back. It can only be used for learning to go forward and not for accounting. Similarly, the amount of time I've spent on my relationship should not factor into my decision for the future. It should only be based on what I feel in the present moment about my future prospects. So this is very important, and people making decisions on this routinely make a mistake by being bogged down by the past. So think of the past as baggage. You don't want to carry it around with you. The past is gone, let it go. So it's just a sign of unclear thinking, a mistake of logic to keep accounting with what's invested in the past. Third one, we have spent so much money on tutors and my skills have still not improved. Even though I believe the next tutor will succeed, I have lost too much money to justify any further expense. If I really believe that the next tutor will succeed, then the question is, what's the value of that success? And if the cost is less than that value, I should go for it. It has no connection with how much I've already spent, because that money is lost. The only future prospect is, if I put this money in, I'll get this value out. And is it a good deal for me standing where I am right now? So it's the same logic for all three of them. We get to another fundamental question now. How do you know that you have made a decision? What needs to happen? Think about this for a moment, pause the video, and write down, what do you think is the sign that you've made a decision? What needs to happen? Assuming you've written down, you can compare it with what we have here. A sign that you've made a decision is that you've made a somewhat irrevocable allocation of resources. Think about this again. If you go into a car dealership and you buy a car, the point at which you've said to have made a decision is when you've signed the dotted line and you've made the payment, where there's no turning back. In fact, if you change your mind, there's always going to be some kind of penalty, or the car dealer will tell you, sorry, we've sold you the car. If you want to sell it back to us, it's a used car now. So anytime you're dealing with decisions, there have to be some resources of yours that you need to allocate. And sometimes it's money, sometimes it's time, but it's always something that you have that you're going to have to give up. That's what a decision is about. So if you don't find that you have to make any allocation of resources, then you're not really facing a decision. You're just thinking. Okay, thinking is good, but it's not a decision. To get it to decision land, there has to be an action with resources. Who is the best judge of a good decision? The best judge of a good decision would be, and write down your answer again, pause the video, and when you're ready, move on. You, the decision maker, is the best judge of a good decision. This should be clear by now that you really are the only person who will fully understand what you knew at the time of making the decision. So unless someone else could get into your head and really know what you knew, it's very hard to judge other people's decisions. And this sort of underscores the futility of judging others. The only people we can really help is ourselves. Okay, so how do I judge the quality of my decision? Well, we'll have to use the process that we employ to make our decision. That's how we're going to judge the quality of our decision. And what's that process? Well, we like to call it the 6 elements of decision quality. The 6 dimensions on which we will judge the quality of our decision. The first is, what can we do? Do we know our alternatives well enough? A lot of times people will just take an advocacy-driven path. Advocacy is perhaps the worst way to make decisions because it involves picking an alternative that I like and not even attempting to create other options. So this one alternative fixation is terrible, and it actually is also connected with deception. So a lot of times when people are advocating, what they'll do is they'll take an alternative and they'll stack it up against other alternatives that actually don't really make sense. And politicians do this all the time. They'll give you an option saying, oh, we need to do this. Why? Because the other alternatives are terrible. And indeed, they will look terrible. The only issue is that those may not even be realistic alternatives. And maybe if we were to brainstorm, we could find a whole bunch of good alternatives. So put it another way, any idiot can decide between a good and a bad alternative. But the real challenge is when we have to decide between 2 good alternatives. So that's where we want to be. If we're just having one good and all terrible ones, we don't have much of a decision to make. To make sure that we are increasing the quality of our decision process, we need to generate enough feasible, creative alternatives that give us some level of value. And then we can now employ our thinking to pick between them. So it should be just a very fundamental step of decision making, generating creative alternatives. Information is about what we know. So have we taken the time to really figure out what is it, knowing which I would change my decision one way or the other? So we're not just talking about any data, we're talking about that information which changes my mind. And once we know what that would be, then we would go ahead and find it. For instance, if you go to the doctor and the doctor says, hey, you need a particular blood test, or you need this particular test, the question you must always ask the doctor is, doctor, will the results of the test change your decisions on my treatment? And if the doctor says no, I'll give you the same medicines regardless, that test is completely useless. That information doesn't change a decision, and you're better off not doing it, not investing in it, because if it doesn't change your decision, then why bother? So information is only important insofar as it changes your decision. So, and knowing what that information is very, very important. Then we also want to make sure that the information is reliable. We have taken some effort to search and to remove our biases as much as possible. Third, preferences and values. This is about what you want. And in a sense, this is really about who you are. Do you really know your values? Do you know what you want in a particular decision context? And if not, then we need to slow down and sit down and think about that. Without preferences, we can't really come to a decision. So these are the three pillars, the three legs of the decision-making stool. And in this graphic, the seat of the stool is the logic that ties these three things together. So this is a very, very simple way of putting this all together. The logic is really about being consistent with your preferences, with what you can do and what you know, and coming up with the best decision. So in a very simple manner, you don't want to be violating your preferences. For instance, if you say you like chocolate ice cream, and when you have to make a decision, you go with vanilla ice cream, even though they're both the same price, that would be a mistake. Mistake because you're being inconsistent with your own preferences. So the yardstick of good decision making is consistency. Consistency with your preferences, consistency with your values, and with the information that you have about realizing them. Now, of course, all of this sits on a frame. Frame is really the way in which you describe a decision. As in, are you climbing the right mountain? So we can do a lot of analysis and climb it very efficiently, but if you're climbing the wrong mountain and that's not where you really want to go, then there's no point of doing an analysis. So the frame is really about knowing or looking at the right picture, not too big and not too small, but just right. And it's also about getting clarity on the assumptions you're making. Do you know very clearly what decisions are outside your frame? What decisions have already been made and what decisions are coming up? We'll have more to say on this in a moment. And finally, the sixth element of decision quality is commitment to action. Of course, the most important element, most important person here in this picture is you, the decision maker who's sitting on the stool. So very important to be committed to action. You can be analyzing all you like, but if you don't make a commitment, there's no point. So one important thing to think about is a lot of times people don't want to commit, thinking it's a reduction of freedom when you commit. So at one level that is true. When you commit to something, it means you're not committing to something else. But at another level, if you really think about it, you are free to do a million things in this world, and you chose at this very moment to be listening to this video. So that commitment that you gave here is not so much a curtailment of your freedom, it's actually the highest expression of it. Freedom is meaningless if you don't express it, and the only way you can express your freedom is by committing. So that's how you know you're free. Why? Because you're free to commit. That's a high-level way of looking at it. At another level, of course, it is a good idea to think about maintaining your options as much as possible and creating more options for yourself so that you always have the freedom to commit differently in the future. And that's always a good idea to generate more options. With that, let's keep going. So another way of visualizing the 6 elements of decision quality is with this diagram, which shows it as a sort of a chain, where creative alternatives are about what your choices are, useful information is about what you know, sound reasoning is, are you thinking straight about this, commitment to follow through is, will you really take action, helpful frame is, what is it that you're deciding, and clear values is what consequences do I care about. The same thing that we discussed in the previous slide in the graphic. But the idea behind this chain is to drive home the point that your decision may be as weak as your weakest link. So you want to tune up on all of these elements to get a high quality decision. Moving on, we can visualize the quality of our decision with spider diagrams. A spider diagram is simply a chart that goes from 0 in the center to 10 in the edges. So these are all 10s, and you look at each of these dimensions of value and you decide, okay, for instance, appropriate frame. Where would I put myself on framing? Am I clear about the decision? Am I happy with the scope of the decision? Where, is it too big? Is it too small? Am I clear about the assumptions I'm making? Am I clear about the decision itself that I'm making and the future decisions? If I'm clear about all this, I could give myself a high score on this. If not, so for instance, John's decision spider, he's kind of midway here. He's still got some work to do on the frame. Commitment to action, John thinks he's all the way up there to the end. Once he knows what the right decision is, he has no problem carrying it out. Logic, pretty low, so John doesn't really know. In this case, what this is telling me is he doesn't really know how to put everything together. Clear values and trade-offs needs some more work. He's on the lower end here, around 4 maybe. Meaningful, reliable information, he's probably past the halfway point in gathering good information. Creative, doable alternatives, this is low. And this means John's time is well spent brainstorming with friends or by himself alternatives that might be very feasible for him. So these are the two pillars, two elements where the most amount of workers is needed, and we can immediately see this from a decision spider. So you can easily draw this for yourself and for your family and friends who are struggling with a decision, to help them reflect which are the elements that they really need to be focusing on. Hi, my name is Somik Raha, and I welcome you to a session on making good decisions. Okay, so let's try an exercise. Let's pick a real decision problem that you are facing, and let's try to draw your decision spider. And once we have your spider, we're going to test each element and see how we can improve it. So to start, let's try to... So the spider diagram is really easy to draw. So we start by marking a center point, and there are 6 elements. So here are the 6 elements of decision quality, and all these points symbolize a 10, and these are all zeros. So on a scale of 0 to 10, let's talk about the quality of our frame. How well do we know what our assumptions are, what our givens are, what our future decisions are, and what our current decision is? And so if you're really not that clear on what is it that we're deciding, we might say, well, what if it's let's say a 3, okay? Now, what about clear values and preferences? Well, on this metric, we might say, it's I'm pretty clear about what I want. It's maybe it's a 6. Next, let's talk about alternatives. So, creative, doable alternatives. Are we stacking up just one alternative and the others are just really pretty lousy ones? Or have we taken the time to brainstorm and come up with really good alternatives? Suppose I say, I don't really know, I just have 2 alternatives in front of me. Okay. Let's say the decision maker says, that's you basically saying, it's a 3 for me. So let's see how this is shaping up. So far we have this. Okay, what about meaningful, reliable information? By meaningful, I really mean useful. So does the information that we have at hand help us make our decision? Do we know what information we need that might change our decision? And how reliable is that information? So how do we feel about the quality of the information we have right now? And suppose we've done a lot of research and say, I've really done a good job here. Maybe it's an 8. Okay, an 8. What about the logic that I'm employing to put it all together? I'd say that I haven't really, since the frame is not very clear, I'm not very sure how I'm going to put all this together. Even after the frame is clarified, I'm kind of confused how to make a decision. Alright, if I feel that way, maybe it's a 2 here. Okay, and let's say this one's a commitment to action. Yeah, so in this one, once I know that the decision is what this, once I'm clear about my decision, I'm just going to go do it. So suppose commitment is not an issue for me. Let's say I'll put a 9 on this. Okay. Now let's compare this to where it should be, or what we should be aiming for. Let's pick another color. So where we'd like to be, somewhere here, there. So that's how far off we are on our spider. And let me mark the axes there. So that's our little spider diagram. We don't really need the grids, but we can kind of immediately, looking at this, say that we're extremely weak on the creative doable alternatives, we are weak on the clear frame, and we're very weak on logic. So these are the 3 pieces we would focus most of our energy on in improving the quality of this decision. Of course, this was just an example, and you would want to use the numbers that apply to your situation. So this is a quick example. Now, once that you've completed this exercise, I think it's a very useful thing to do to try to help someone else. So from an individual decision maker, it's important for you to play the role of a decision coach as well, to really get your feet wet with these tools. So find a decision maker, and as their decision coach, you're going to do the following. First, you're going to produce a spider diagram for that decision maker. Then you're going to ask questions, not just to improve the quality of the weakest elements, but also to make sure that when somebody says, hey, I'm an 8 on 10 on information, they really know what they're talking about, that they really have gone out and gathered information, and so on for each of the elements. So you want to check that the assessments people are giving are consistent with what they know about each of those elements. So, and once you check that, then of course the question is, what can you do to improve it even further? So focus on the weakest points, and then go from there, work your way up. So when you're done with that conversation, the third task is to reassess the spider diagram. And that will make it very clear to both you and the decision maker what's the value that's been added. Finally, you're going to ask the decision maker to record 3 things that he or she has learned, and you're going to do the same yourself. And this is very important for you to realize that no matter how good anyone may be at decision making, it really helps to go to someone else to talk through your decision. So just like a doctor will go to another doctor for medical help, whenever you face a decision problem, you need to go to someone who can play the role of a decision coach. And you can definitely help by playing that role for your friends and family. So pause the video now and try to find a decision maker who you can help. And once you're done with this exercise, both the previous one for yourself and for someone else, then we'll talk more about how to improve our process of decision making. Assuming you've had at least one experience of drawing a spider diagram for yourself and for someone else and helping them through, let's go a little deeper. So there are many mistakes that people make when framing decisions. One of the problems is they might frame the decision in a very narrow manner. Another one is they might make it too broad. So when a decision is framed in a very narrow manner, it won't probably make any difference to you because it's so small and narrow that it doesn't really help. And if it's too broad, you don't know where to begin. So it needs to be framed in a way that you can actually take action. The assumptions are the biggest issue in decision frames, where we don't make them explicit. And so the whole point of this exercise of framing is to bring out our assumptions. And decision analysis gives us a very powerful tool called a decision hierarchy. And the decision hierarchy basically is this triangle here on the right, where we mark the givens. The givens are decisions that have already been made by you and are not under question. The current decision, what is it that you're deciding right now? And the future decision, what are you going to decide later? Now, it might come as a surprise to many, but a lot of times people will be having long discussions about stuff without bringing it down to the level of decisions. What are you going to do? So the current decision is a great way of cutting down a lot of unnecessary chatter and bring it to the point. What is it that we can actually do here? What are we talking about? What resources can we allocate? Givens is about decisions that have already been made, and this can be very tricky to extract. So it's very important for decision coaches to think about things that could have been alternatives but are not, because the decision maker has made some assumptions. So for instance, if someone's making a decision on switching their school, then a good given is, and if the frame is that the current decision is, which school should I move to, then a given is, I'm not going to stay in my current school. And by making that explicit, we are allowing ourselves to challenge it by asking, well, what needs to happen at my current school which will allow me to stay on, or which will be interesting enough for me to think about staying on here. So like this, givens are perhaps the most notorious aspect of the decision framing exercise, where it can take a long time to extract it, but it's also the most valuable, because once you challenge it, it can lead to a completely different decision frame. So this is an art and not a science, and it takes many tries to get this right. So that's something to keep in mind. Don't be disheartened if this seems a little difficult. The future decision is also important to frame in this, because it helps us be prepared for what's coming up, and sometimes the way we choose to solve the current decision can be influenced by the future decision that's coming up. In preferences, we oftentimes make a mistake of not being clear about what's of direct and indirect value to us. So direct value is that for which you're willing to put your money on the table right now. Indirect value is everything that affects direct values. So in any decision, do you know what is of direct value to you? Stuff that you'd be willing to pay for? And usually anything that gives you information about the direct value is an indirect value. So think about separating what you know as direct and indirect values. The second level is to be clear about your values, and this is different from the monetary aspects. So direct and indirect values about resources. What are you willing to pay for directly, and what affects what you're willing to pay for indirectly. Whereas when we talk about values, we're talking about really who you are. What do you care about intrinsically? So what's an intrinsic, prudential, and a systemic value? So an intrinsic value is an end in itself for you, and you can't separate what you care about from who you are. So if that's the case, then you're probably talking about something that's very intrinsic to you. If you can tell me why something is important for you, that's a prudential value for you. Prudential is that which is good for us. And if you do any kind of counting analysis, if you have any constructs, laws, or rules that you like, those are all systemic values. You've created a system for yourself. For example, if you, most of us would consider brushing our teeth as prudential for us. But brushing in the morning and night is a system we've created to get to that prudential value. So you can count, you can build a system saying, I want to count how many times I brush. Sure, you can do that. But that's not the same value as dental hygiene. So you're really trying to count something which is important but really can't be counted. Another example that illustrates the intrinsic value is, imagine a soldier killed in Afghanistan from the perspective of the commanding officer of the soldier. So at the level of intrinsic value, the commanding officer says, hey, I've lost a friend or a colleague who I simply can't replace. I can't even begin to talk about trade-offs. That's just ridiculous. This is like a part of me has died. That's the level of intrinsic value. At the level of prudential value, a soldier is useful because you're fighting a war. And so now you have to replace the soldier, you have to do something to increase troop morale. So there are all these practical issues that arise out of losing a soldier. So soldier has a lot of practical value for you. And that's what we mean by prudential value. And finally, the number of troops who have been killed has gone up by 1. That's at the level of systemic value. So now you've reduced a very rich human life from being inseparable from yourself to being separable and useful to you to being a single number. So this dimensionality that we're talking about is also a hierarchy. And understanding what you care about very fundamentally at this level is very clarifying for decisions that that you want to align with your deepest values. So a quick comment on that is, knowing your intrinsic values is about knowing who you are. You are your values. Mistakes in information. Oftentimes we find ourselves being unable to distinguish between data and useful information. So we really want useful information. How do we define that? It's that information which changes our decisions. That's a very, very fundamental point that we're making here. How do you find out what is useful? Well, there are many ways to extract distinctions that we are interested in, and one of them is, imagine that there's a clairvoyant in the room who can answer only factual questions about the future. Okay? No judgments. If you ask the clairvoyant, is something going to be good for me? And the clairvoyant will say, sorry, I don't understand what you mean by good. So the clairvoyant can only answer facts, things that happen. So, and you can ask about the past, present, or the future, and he'll just tell you. So if you had such a person in the room right now, what would you ask? And try it now. Just try writing down. Just pause the video and try writing. What is it that you would ask the clairvoyant? So for instance, if you're thinking about which college you want to go to, and the clairvoyant can tell you factual information, what would you ask? Now remember that you cannot ask questions that have to do with your decisions. So you can't ask how, what will I do in this school? Or how will I do in this school? Because that's a part of your decision. You can't violate your free will. But you can ask, how will the school be ranked in 2 years' time? And if you define what you mean by rank and which particular rankings you're talking about, the clairvoyant can answer that question. So this is really about framing practical questions on things you can actually go find. So when you answer this question, you will actually get a lot of guidance on what to look for. So let's try it now. Pause the video and think about the decision you're looking at, for which you may have drawn a spider, or for someone else, and try the clairvoyant question either on yourself or on someone else, and see what it does for you. And when you're done, move on. Okay, now that you've tried that exercise, we get to another interesting aspect, and that is associative logic errors. So this has to do with sample size, where we often get confused about the way we deal with uncertainty. So for instance, one of the common ways of explaining this is males and hemophilia. So if you have hemophilia, then I would be willing to assign a 99% probability that you're a male, because hemophiliacs are almost virtually all male. But what's the chance that if you're a male, you're a hemophiliac? And it's not 99% for me because there's an extremely small population of males that have hemophilia. So associative logic error is making the mistake of assigning the same probability on both sides when you don't really mean it. So one case where this might come up is a doctor says, hey, I'm seeing a whole bunch of lung cancer patients and they all seem to be smokers. So if you put, in other words, suppose you meet somebody who's a lung cancer patient and someone who's not, and we find out that the lung cancer patient happened to be a smoker, and there's a let's say a 90% chance we think that a lung cancer patient is a smoker. And if the person is not a lung cancer patient, then what's the chance this person's a smoker? Suppose we go with a 50-50 shot that this person might be a smoker. Now, the bigger question here, which we haven't included, and which is the root cause of the associative logic error, is what's the chance that in a population of people who smoke, you pick somebody out of that population, that person's going to be a lung cancer patient. And so suppose we find out that that's 10% chance, and a 90% chance is in that population people don't have lung cancer. Well, that makes a big difference, because now we can figure out what's the chance that if somebody smokes, they are likely to get lung cancer. So let's see. So the way we do this is, we're getting into a little bit of probability, but this is elementary algebra, and this will serve you very well. So these are the probabilities: probability of lung cancer and probability of being a smoker given you have lung cancer. So what's the chance that you are a smoker and you have lung cancer? So it's going to be the product of these two. So there's a 9% chance that you're both a smoker and have lung cancer. There is a 1% chance here that you are a lung cancer patient and not a smoker. Then what this tree is saying is, if somebody doesn't have lung cancer, then there's a 50-50 shot that they are smokers or non-smokers. So then that's basically a product of these is a 45% chance that they don't have lung cancer and are a smoker, and 45% chance that they don't have lung cancer and they are not a smoker. So we have, these are called joint probabilities. Now, in order to do an inference, this is a trick or a simple exercise that will serve you very well whenever you're trying to do inference, when you're trying to infer from what you already know. So let me draw the tree in the reverse in the way we'd like to infer. Okay, so this is what we'd like to figure out, that if you're a smoker, what's the chance of getting lung cancer? So I'm going to match this. So this is L and S. So L and S, 9% chance. L bar and S bar, that's this one. It's a 45% chance. Then this one's, so here we want S and L bar. So that's S and L bar. So it's a 45% chance here. And this is L and S bar. That's L and S bar, a 1% chance. Now notice that all of these add up to 1. Okay, so now if I add these two, what do I get? I get a 54% chance that my sample, 54% chance that somebody in that sample is a smoker, and therefore a 46% chance that they're not a smoker. I just added these two and added these two, and this sums to 1, so I'm the right track. So now what I get here is, if I want to find out what's the chance of getting lung cancer given I'm a smoker in that population, that would be 9 divided by 54 and 45 divided by 54. There, and the sum is 1. Now you can do the same thing here. If you're not a smoker, then there's a 1 over 46 chance that you will you get lung cancer, 45 over 46 chance that you won't. So what this is telling me is, if I know that somebody is a smoker, there's a 9 out of 54 chance. Well, how much is that really? 9 out of 54 is actually 1 over 6. So 1 over 6 chance that this person will get lung cancer, and 5 out of 6 that they won't. 1 over 6 is about 0.166. Now just think about that. If I had made the mistake of saying the chance of getting lung cancer given smoking is the same here as 0.9, look at that difference. If I make this mistake, that's a huge mistake to make. There's only a 16.6% chance of getting lung cancer if I start with these beliefs. Whereas I might have fooled myself into thinking that, oh, because 90% of the people who get lung cancer are smokers, the chance of getting lung cancer is 90%. That's a routine mistake we can make. Now, I must caution you that it may be that 16.6% chance of getting lung cancer is still a pretty high chance. And but that's the level at which we're talking, as in it's not a 90% chance, it's a 16.6% chance, given what we started off with. So there's nothing in this information set that didn't come from what we already knew. That's another golden rule about information. You cannot do inference in a vacuum. It's basically when you know two things and you as in the chance of two things happening together, and then you specify one, you can find out what it means, what the other one is likely to be. And there's nothing in this that came from, magic. It all came from you, these numbers. And you can try that. You can play the same exercise with your own numbers, and you'll have a very powerful tool of inference for yourself. Mistakes and alternatives. So we've touched upon this already. People often make this mistake where they get into advocacy-driven decision-making. And especially if you get into politics, this is a huge problem. And not just politics, actually, even in activism, environmental activism, a lot of value is completely destroyed by constantly going for advocacy. Advocacy does not yield to high-quality decisions because you're getting attached to one thing without any interest in actually discovering value. So it's very important that you take a detective's role and say, I really don't know what's the best decision. I want to find out. And let me consider all of the 6 elements and see what comes up at the end of that process. So hold off on choosing a position. Again, we've kind of mentioned this earlier. There is really no decision to be made between good and bad alternatives. Anyone can tell you, yeah, go with the good one. The issue is, do we have enough alternatives to say that we have to make a choice between 2 good alternatives? So we want to check whether we are in that position where we are confused between 2 good options. And if you're not, the question to be asked is, are we confused? Why are we not confused? Is it because we're coming from a space of clarity or a space of advocacy? And if it's the latter, then we want to step back and generate more options and analyze them. Mistakes in logic are about being inconsistent with our preferences mostly, but once you learn the math behind this, it's really easy to prevent this. This is where decision theory really helps us, and decision analysis is founded on decision theory. So this is the easy part of decision analysis, as in garbage in, garbage out. The hard part is to get all the other steps together, the soft stuff, and frame it properly. So combining the two, decision analysis helps us get to clarity of action. Mistakes in commitment, we could suffer from analysis paralysis and never end up committing to action. And we can't really be a decision maker if we don't commit to action. So this is a question I touched on earlier to review. Does commitment really reduce your freedom? And I would argue that no, it is actually the highest expression of our freedom. And knowing that will help us prevent analysis paralysis. At the same time, it is also important to consider that you do want to create options for yourself. So you don't want to tie yourself down without the freedom to change your mind. So another hallmark of this approach is you'll find yourself being comfortable with fluidity, where you are, you may have committed to one course of action, but that course of action has within it the option to change your mind in the future. So creating options or getting into commitments that allow you to change your mind when you get better information is a sign of high quality decision making. What about group decision making? Well, I'm really sorry, there's no such thing. I mean, if someone's telling you this, I don't think they're being totally honest. If there was a rational way of making group decisions, there would be no political science, no marriage counseling. People would just do the right thing. So we can't really rationally agree on a process to make group decisions. We can agree with voting or whatever method we have or dictatorial decision making, but there's nothing in it that's rational. That's just there are no axioms for it. You just decide to go with one process or the other, whichever you like. So what we can do, however, is agree to align our values, beliefs, and alternatives to act as a single decision maker. So the group can act as a single person, and all of these tools can be used. So that's one thing that has worked very well for people who make decisions, that they align themselves, and then we can use these tools. There are three types of decisions, and this is pretty important to note. So the majority of financial decisions fall in the space of what we call prudential decision making. This is about that which is prudent for you. But there's also a legal aspect, as in you might make a decision that's prudent, but it may or may not be legal for you. And then there's the question of ethics. You may make decisions that are prudential and legal, but are not ethical. So ethics is really about your morality. So decision making really touches on all three aspects, and decision analysis in particular is connected to only the prudential piece. So one way of thinking about the legal aspect is this is really that subset of your personal ethical code that you're willing to impose on others by force. So how much of your personal ethics do you want to impose on other people? That's what we mean by our legal system. So we've touched on this talk mostly on the prudential aspect, but these other two aspects are also very important. As we wrap up this presentation, there are some things that you can do to further your decision education. One is you could check out the Decision Education Foundation. They have some interesting resources which is more targeted towards high school students. To take this at a more advanced level, I would recommend considering decision analysis from Stanford University. There are other universities too that offer this. For Stanford, scpd.stanford.edu is a good place to begin, especially if you're in a company and you can take classes at Stanford online. On ethics and legal systems, we have not spent too much time on this presentation. So if people want to read more about this, one excellent resource is to read Professor Ronald Howard. He's the person who teaches decision analysis at Stanford, and he and a former student have written this book called Ethics for the Real World, which captures what he teaches at Stanford on the ethical aspect of decision making. And by way of introduction, Professor Howard is pretty much the founder of decision analysis at Stanford. And whatever I've presented is basically the result of his work and the work of other pioneers in the field along with him. The second book on legal systems that is very much aligned to what we teach at Stanford in a class called Voluntary Social Systems is basically the approach of looking at the ethics of liberty. So as I mentioned earlier, the legal system is that part of your personal ethical code that you're willing to impose on others by force. So the Ethics of Liberty is a very interesting book by Murray Rothbard, which looks at the ethical aspect of legal systems. And this is by way of caution. This is not about any one particular way of thinking about political philosophies or legal systems, but it's really a very fundamental way of thinking about freedom. So when we make decisions that affect the freedom of others, how should we be thinking straight about this? And it's very important to have that perspective, because in a lot of political situations, especially in when we find ourselves in the position of activism, we're often talking about passing laws. So are we thinking enough on the dimension of alternative generation do we have voluntary alternatives on the table along with our coercive ones, because all laws are basically coercive. So do we have enough? And we don't want to be picking legal systems or passing laws just because we can, but only because it really is going to help. So that's basically what this book will help stretch our frame on, and is highly recommended reading if people have interest in legal decision making. That's it. Thank you so much for watching this, and I wish you all the best in your decision making. Thank you.